All right. Good evening or good day, depending on where you are. Today, we welcome a special guest, Bennett Zelner. Thank you very much for joining us from New York, I assume. So just a little bit of background about Bennett. So he's an associate professor at the University of Maryland, and he's working at the intersection of regenerative economics, leadership, and psychedelics. That's why he's here with us today. Bennett has a long-standing interest in studying the process of institutional change, which he previously studied in the context of neoliberal policy reform and also the diffusion of the American or Anglo-American shareholder capitalism, and is now examining it under the lens of the legalization of psychedelic medicines. And he has various advisory and director roles, such as at the Evolute Institute. So without further ado, Bennett, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thanks a lot for taking the time. And
Thank
maybe
you.
to get
Yeah.
the ball rolling, Bennett, tell us a little bit more about your background, since you started out your academic career as, I would say, a classic economist, dealing with question of economic policies, risk assessment and mitigation strategies for investments, etc. And now you've made a shift in your research, and you're more dealing with topics at the nexus of regenerative economics, leadership, and psychedelics. So how come?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So first, thank you for having me. I'm excited for our conversation. Um, yeah, so I'll just dive right in. I did spend the first part of my career, as you noted, doing more traditional sorts of business school professor uh, work or research. Uh, yeah, so I was doing this research in these more traditional areas, and I was doing relatively well. I was publishing papers. I got tenure, which is kind of always a big milestone for academics. But I felt very disconnected from my work and from my life in general, I would say. And about 10 years ago, so I was kind of struggling with this, and I was placing the blame on myself. I thought, well, something's wrong with me that I'm not, why am I not more motivated? And academics, especially ones who go on to get tenure, so all the people who surrounded me are generally super into their work. So I really felt like this was some kind of deficiency within myself. And about 10 years ago, I began to engage with psychedelics in an intentional setting. And one of the first kind of kind of epiphanies. I don't mean to exaggerate, but it really felt like an epiphany. One of the first epiphanies I had was the recognition that part of the reason, or probably the main reason I felt so disconnected from my work and from my life, is that the object of my study, the economic system, is in many ways dysfunctional. And I already, to be honest, I already knew this, and I knew it inside. But in order to surface that realization and bring it into my consciousness, it meant questioning my whole identity. So that happened, and then I thought, well, I probably need to go find a new job. Like, I can't continue to do this work, if it doesn't feel, if I don't feel that it's, really meaningful. And I continued to have more of these kind of intentional experiences with psychedelics. And during some of the experiences, I began to think about economics, which is not what I had intended to think about, but that's what happened. And I started to think there were kind of two parts. I started to think in a more focused way about what the specific nature of the dysfunction of our current economic system is. And I also started to think about what alternatives might look like. And a lot of the ideas I had around alternatives were related to principles from nature, principles from natural systems, and we can certainly talk more about that. But I didn't know what was that these ideas that I was having were part of what was an emergent field of which I was unaware. It's an emergent field called regenerative economics, and I think probably a lot of economists also wouldn't be familiar with that term because it comes more out of systems theory than out of kind of mainstream economic theory. But in any case, At that point, I realized I maybe didn't need to find a new job, and I could just maybe shift what I was focusing on. And it took me a few years to figure out how to do that. Really crystallized when I came into contact with folks from organizations like USONA and MAPS, and had a chance to start talking about my ideas to a broader audience for the first time. And I found that there's a lot of appetite for them within the psychedelic field, because there are so many people in the psychedelic field who don't want to see the field become imprinted by the same business as usual patterns that at least I would argue are contributing to a lot of the widespread mental distress that we see in the first place. So there's an appetite for this kind of thing, and it gave me a chance to kind of put some ideas on paper, as it were, for the first time. And that kind of started that kind of launched the current phase of my career. And I have kind of two focal topics. One topic is the development of regenerative economic approaches for delivering psychedelic assisted mental health treatment, if you want to call it that, or psychedelic assisted experiences. And we can talk more about that distinction as well. And then the second part of it, it focuses, as you already alluded to, on leadership. And I'm conducting a research study with my close colleague, Rochelle Sampson, who's also at the University of Maryland. We both teach in the Smith School of Business there. And we're conducting a study called the Connected Leadership Study, in which we're examining the effects of psychedelic-assisted consciousness expanding experiences on creativity and decision-making by organizational leaders. So that's my story up until now.
Yeah, thank you. Fascinating how you translated your insights and your epiphanies during your psychedelic journeys into your career, and how you changed directions. And I can imagine it is quite a daring move to do that in an academic establishment which still predominantly holds neoliberal classical economic theories very dearly. And you have mentioned the fact that during your own psychedelic experiences, you saw more and more that the problems that we are facing as a society are actually partially triggered or caused by the economic system. So maybe you could give our viewers or listeners a little bit more background on what it is that you find problematic with our economic system.
Yeah, so I can definitely say a few words about that. So I guess it's kind of, for context, I'll just note that if we look at the way natural systems work, the universe has designed these intricate systems that for a very long period of time have been able to self-regenerate and maintain systemic health. And there are several, even though all those systems have differences, there are, I think, kind of universal principles that that inform them all. So one principle, for example, would be the principle of recirculation. In nature, nothing is wasted. Nothing is wasted. All resources are recirculated. Waste from one part of the system is an input to another part of the system. Our economic system, on the other hand, has pretty much the opposite pattern, and has a pattern that I refer to as extractive, in which virtually all resources are extracted from the bottom to the top and from the periphery to the center to benefit one single group, financial shareholders, over all others. And it's very difficult for a system like that to survive. If you constantly accumulate resources in one part of the system, then that's going to be at the expense of systemic health. So if you think about the human body, for example, the heart pumps blood to all the different parts of the body. It doesn't hoard the blood, because if it did, your feet wouldn't get blood, your brain wouldn't get blood, your toes wouldn't get blood, and that obviously would be poor for systemic health. And in this case, of course, you're the system, right? So our economic system, just to make it a little bit more concrete, I think the kind of an archetypal example is the large publicly traded corporation. So large corporations first of all, like here in the US, and I think in many other places, local businesses on Main Street have been replaced by outposts of large centralized corporations that are headquartered elsewhere. So these corporations are extracting the bulk of the economic proceeds produced in a community out of that community, out of the local ecosystem. So they're extracting financial capital, if you want to think about it more in economic terms. And then the same, and they're extracting it again to these different, to this one concentrated group that's completely disconnected from the local ecosystem. These same large corporations are run by managers who often make decisions about how to use resources, about how to use different forms of human capital, different forms of physical capital, knowledge capital. They make decisions about how to use resources in local ecosystems that, again, because the managers themselves are disconnected from the local ecosystems, they're not making the decisions in a way that take into account their effects on systemic health and their effects on the ability of the local ecosystem to regenerate itself. So you have these different forms of disconnection, this shareholder disconnection or financial disconnection, this managerial connection, leading to the extraction of financial and other types of resources from local community ecosystems. And then in addition to that, we've had, during the past 50 years in particular, but I think this really predates that, during the past 50 years in particular, there's been a decline in community institutions and the types of places where people used to come together. And there's been a real increase in kind of hyper-individualism and social disconnection. I mean, here in the US, the Surgeon General proclaimed that we're having a loneliness epidemic, and you often hear about a crisis of disconnection. So this social disconnection bolsters economic disconnection, and it further kind of leads to further degeneration in the local social systems that are necessary to support robust local economic activity in which resources recirculate at the local level. So that's kind of the, we could say, I could talk more about it, but that's kind of the nature. That's the nature of the problem.
Yeah. And I mean, what stands out from your description is really the word disconnection. And that reminds me also what other pioneering thinkers, for instance, like Otto Scharmer from the MIT, has said that the many crises that we currently witness, be it the ecological crisis, the climate crisis, the geopolitical rising tensions, warfare, etc., have all some underlying currents, and these currents are basically rooted in the crisis of disconnection, and on three levels: disconnection from self, from others, and from nature. And I hear there's a lot of resonance to what you said.
Absolutely, yes. So there are kind of two terms used right now: polycrisis and metacrisis. It feels like folks are moving more toward polycrisis. I like metacrisis because I think it connotes more what you were talking about, that there's a common root for these crises. And yeah, disconnection is I think is that common root. I sometimes think about it in terms of our kind of worldview, or what others have called our attunement. So an attunement is the way you orient to the world. And we have a deeply embedded attunement, one that's kind of socialized into us by all of our institutions, an attunement that is mechanistic or disconnected, an attunement in which we view ourselves as fundamentally separate beings, separate from other people, separate from nature. And it's that kind of mechanistic, disconnected attunement, whatever term you want to use, that I think is the common root of all these crises. And we at some point, we can either talk about this now or a little bit later if you want. We could talk about what an alternative to that might look like. But in terms of a diagnosis, I agree. And I think if you look at the nature of the crises we're having in multiple systems, they can all be traced to this disconnected or mechanistic attunement in one way or another.
It's very, very, very interesting. And that it's kind of the crisis of attunement, or a lacking attunement, actually, which leads to isolation and disconnection. And so the question is, since you're also interested in leadership, so what is the role of leaders amid this unfolding catastrophe? So
we clearly, it seems like we need leadership to help us navigate toward a brighter future. And the question is, what would that leadership look like? What type of leadership? And I think if you look at, this is a little bit of I'm going to use a little bit of a caricature here, but if you think about the most traditional example of this kind of heroic leader, this patriarchal leader who directs others according to some master plan that they already have in mind, it's that type of leadership that arguably has contributed to the crises, to the meta crisis that we now face. So the question is, what would an alternative form of leadership look like? And I would characterize, so when I think about connected leadership, I think about connected leadership as having several attributes. So going back to this idea of attunement, I think perhaps the most important one is what I would refer to as a connected attunement or a symbiotic attunement. An attunement in a way of orienting to the world that recognizes the intrinsic interconnectedness of all things and beings, and that also recognizes the mutuality of the patterns and the relationships that give rise to life. So I think this kind of where leaders are being guided from is probably is the first thing. The second thing is moving beyond this idea of this heroic or patriarchal leader who kind of knows everything. That's not possible. We live in a world of complex systems, and it's not possible for a complex system to be led by or even kind of fully understood in some sense by one person or by a small group of people. If you look at the way the systems work in nature, they have a much more distributed pattern of decision making, if you will. So when I think about a connected leader, I think about someone who leads by catalyzing the collective intelligence of their organization or of the team that they're leading, which is also very much the way natural systems work. If you look at any type, think about a forest. You have trees and a mycelial network. You have different animals, and there's rain, there's sun. There are all these different elements of nature that contribute, that have a distinctive contribution, a unique contribution to make to the way this system functions. And there's no single element that's leading the others. They're all collaborating, if you will, in a deeply symbiotic way. So I'd say those would be the two main, those would be the two main things that I would say.
Yeah, that makes me chime in a bit. I've been quiet so far. I think that's really fascinating. And when I hear you speak, Bennett, I think, interesting. I hear this distinction that Ian McGilchrist makes between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And this kind of the mechanistic worldview and interactions based on this, which you described as kind of power over and trying systems control in a way from a top-down position. That is kind of the archetypal representation of the left hemisphere and in this framework. And then right hemisphere is what you say. And I would even say, like, is there a mechanistic attunement really? Because it's not attunement really, for me, belongs into the category of the other side, the right hemisphere, where actually it's much more relational, perceiving the connections and having a different view of yourself. Less the strategos, the strategist, the general, and much more those new metaphors for leadership. And I love what you said, like the catalyzing the collective intelligence. And I think, like, as role models, and I would like to have your opinion on it, would you say, like, the modern leader is like a gardener, he's like a host, he's like a conductor, or that's too power over, he's more like a dancer, he's dancing with the system? So what are kind of regenerative metaphors for, like, thinking about having a role model, like a new kind of metaphoric role model for leaders?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're putting me on the spot because you're assuming perhaps that I have a good metaphor already. But I like of the ones that you of the options listed, I would
Yes.
go with gardener probably first. It definitely
Cool.
has a regenerative flavor, you know, or
Yeah.
maybe cultivator, even though that may not be, that's a word that may not resonate as much for some people. I guess I would add one other point as well. There's a sense in which the leadership itself, I mean, I guess we've already been saying this old view, this old model of the single heroic leader is outdated. It doesn't work. It has all these issues. That doesn't necessarily imply that there's another even type of leader who would take that person's place, but maybe another type of leadership. And that leadership itself, and it would take us a while to get to this place because we're very, you know, we're conditioned otherwise. But that leadership itself might also be kind of emergent. It's leadership that might, in some situations, we might see leadership coming from one part of the system. In other situations, you might see leadership coming from another part of the system. So I think part of it is learning how to be like that. So, okay, so an example that I sometimes use when I give talks is a flock of birds. So a flock of birds has this beautiful, coherent shape, and it's able to adapt to differences in conditions. It's able to adapt to differences in wind speed, fly south for the winter. There is no one bird that's leading that flock. The pattern of the flock, these properties I just mentioned, these system level properties, like the shape and the speed and the direction and all that stuff, these are emergent properties. So it's in that sense that there's this kind of emergent leadership within the flock. You can't say one bird is doing it. It's a property of the flock itself. And that's, I think, ultimately, you know, kind of the direction to try to steer toward.
Yeah, wonderful. So I mean, and still people like they ask about their role, right? So what's my role? And then you do leadership, okay, and leadership like a swarm, okay. But then still people might be inspired, right, when they hear like certain ways of talking about this, like you are maybe dancing with the system, so you're more like a dancer, or maybe you're a modern conductor, not like the old school conductors, which were also more hierarchical, but more like a Lenny Bernstein kind of type of conductor or so, or other metaphors. And I think it might still be useful. While I love your idea that actually let's talk more about leadership than be on the systems level and not so much like about individuals. Yeah.
Yeah, and also I think another reason it is also still useful to talk about individuals, as you were, you know, as I was kind of saying, and as you were saying a little bit, we're not used to operating this way, at least not. I think we have instinct to do this. I think it comes from, you know, we have this instinct as part of who we are, and I can say more about why I think that. That's kind of a separate rabbit hole we can go down if you want. But we certainly haven't been conditioned to behave in this way. So, for example, if you look at, there are some alternative organizational forms that are less hierarchical than what we traditionally associate with large organizations, like holacracy, which a number of organizations have tried. And it doesn't always work. In fact, it often doesn't work. Co-ops often run into governance challenges. And part of it is complexity, which is, again, a separate topic that we can talk about. Part of it is that we haven't been taught, we haven't learned how to live and collaborate in that way. So I think that at the current time, if we want to think not only about kind of where we want to get to, but how we might get there, there is a role for people who are currently in leadership positions and already have a significant degree, not just of economic influence, but of social and even cultural influence to show another way, of being. And so, yeah, so I do think there's a need for these kind of transitional leaders to help us move from one kind of attunement, one paradigm to the other.
And then you actually touched upon a point that I wanted to raise in my next question, and it is really we see that we are in dire need of a new story, also story about leadership and what is good and worthwhile leadership. And I was wondering, well, how can we cultivate such qualities that allow us to lead from a different place, right? So how can we create leaders on also organizations and on a higher level, maybe even systems that are based on attunement, that are based on a sense of collaboration instead of kind of die-hard competition. How do we get there?
I mean, that's obviously an enormous question, and I can't claim to have the entire answer. But I do have a couple of thoughts about it, of course. So first of all, we can put into place all the new kind of policies and prescriptions that we want to, but none of that it's not going to take us far enough until we actually have the shift in here. So this necessarily starts inside. The reason the flock of birds can collaborate, can harmonize in the way that it does, is that each bird is guided by this kind of symbiotic attunement, if you will. Then the question is, so I think the number one, if you were to ask me, how could the world change by tomorrow?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if we get everybody to shift their attunement between now and tomorrow from a mechanistic or a disconnected attunement to a symbiotic or a connected one, that would literally do it. But that's also, that's not a very helpful answer because it doesn't really tell you much about how to get there. So in terms of how to get there, first of all, I think that the right types, there are practices that people can engage in to help them connect to this innate wisdom, if you will. So I think a lot of it is, and I don't just mean psychedelics, although we'll talk about psychedelics, but I also mean things like meditation, and there are certain types of coaching practices that help people learn to move out of this kind of egoistic, help them kind of, move underneath or move beyond their egoistic patterns, and help them move beyond their defense mechanisms and move into a place where they're more in touch with this, kind of intrinsic interconnectedness, where they feel that in a more embodied way. Now that's I'm saying that as if it's easy to get there. It's obviously not, and you might do meditation for 20 years and never get there. So I think psychedelics have a role to play. And I think that for some people, at least, they can be accelerants. Everybody's psychedelic experience is different, but if you look at research on psychedelics, one of the primary channels through which they lead to reductions in clinical symptoms and improvements in well-being is by helping people connect or reconnect, as you were kind of suggesting earlier, to themselves, to others, and to nature or the wider world. And part of the reason they're able to open people to reconnection is, for some people at least, perhaps for many people, in their psychedelic experiences, they have an embodied sense of their connection. So this is something that actually happened to me. I'd already been working on regenerative economics for some time, and it was kind of motivated by some of those sorts of feelings as I discussed earlier. But I was still very much, I'm a professor, I'm very in my head, big surprise. And I had this experience where I knew, and know isn't even the right word, where I felt that the regenerative pattern, nature's pattern, wasn't something that surrounded me. It was something that was inside of me. So it was, and I hate to be like cliched and woo, but it was the oneness, And I think when people have that embodied sense of oneness, an embodied sense of nature's pattern, that can really help to lead to this, to a shift in attunement, to use the language that we were just using earlier. I think one additional benefit of psychedelics for leaders, we talked earlier about the old model doesn't work anymore. And part of the reason for that is complexity. We live in a world of complex systems, and arguably leaders today are facing ever greater levels of complexity. So we can theorize that psychedelics, and there's a little bit of research behind this, but I would definitely say it's an emergent area of research. We can at least suggest that perhaps psychedelics might have the ability to help people, to help leaders navigate complexity better. For example, psychedelics have been shown, psilocybin in particular, have been shown to increase connectivity among parts of the brain, to increase communication among different parts of the brain. So one possibility is that this enhanced neural connectivity leads to more holistic thinking, or what's sometimes referred to as synthetic thinking, in which people or leaders are able to combine, able to kind of generate new ideas and combine elements or concepts, or or kind of understandings of different parts of the world they didn't previously see as separate, or able to be combined into these kind of new ideas and cohesive solutions. I hope that made sense. It's a little.
It did. I mean, Chris, maybe you have a point to make, since you scribbling down something, and I feel you wanted to ask something.
Oh yeah, I mean, so yeah, that's very interesting. So some people have said like it enhances creativity, right, or innovative thinking, or so on.
Right.
Now you say more like holistic synthetic thinking. I would also, I mean, my hypothesis would be that it enhances your emotional intelligence and your relational abilities. And of course, as leadership is mostly through, I mean, you're active and you have power in the world through other people as a leader. So of course, those relational and then of course communication skills are crucial. And if you're better at relating and empathizing, your impact might be enhanced as well. So does that resonate? Is that something that you?
Absolutely, yes. So I think that's I think what you're describing is part of, is deeply intertwined with what I think of, with what I'm talking about when I use the term attunement. I think when you have this more connected or symbiotic attunement, you rediscover your innate ability to collaborate with others in the way that you're describing, to harmonize with others. And yeah, when at some point we can talk a little bit about some of the research that we've already done, and we've seen examples of that with some of our research participants as well. So for sure. So I think it's both. I think it's a change. I think it's relational. And I think there's also probably a cognitive component as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I was wondering, because the interesting thing is, if you tell people, yeah, it can make you thinking better, right? You're like more creative, and you're more like you have those special thinking powers. It's almost like it could be understood as reinforcing like some more egoic powers in a way.
Sure.
You just get smarter and better at whatever you're doing. You understand the systems better, and so you can be better at manipulating. But actually, the main point is actually, if you feel or sense the system better, then you don't have this clear boundary maybe anymore between yourself and others, and you say like, okay, what is more actually in the interest of the whole? So this is, I think,
I know 100%, and that's why the first point when I talk about or think about connected leadership is always the point about attunement. It's about lead to where. It's one thing to say, oh, this will make you more creative, but I think that's kind of basically what you're saying. If you could use your enhanced creativity to do all kinds of things, some of which might be better for systemic health and some of which might not be. So it's this question of guidance as well.
So connecting to the argument that Christopher made, right? Theoretically, well, you could just become even smarter at outsmarting the system or doing things for your own gain. Whereas, of course, your underlying intention as well, psychedelics can be a path of transcending narrow concepts of self, so that we can actually assume more responsibility and can hold more of the complexity, and have the embodied visceral realization that everything is a lot more interconnected than we think, and maybe that everything is interconnected in essence. But at the same time, is there evidence showing that this is causing such a shift in people? Because there are some very prominent figures out there in the world, I won't mention the names, but who have taken psychedelics repeatedly and still seem to be even more obsessed with certain visions of might and power and dominance.
100%. I mean, so this goes back to the famous term coined by Stan Grof, that psychedelics are a non-specific amplifier. And to be sure, I've been witness to people who are narcissists who take psychedelics and become more narcissistic. I don't have a perfect answer for that. I do think that, to respond specifically to your question, there is first the research from clinical studies showing that psychedelics, at least for a lot of the participants in those studies, led to increases in psychological connection, or psychological connectedness, I should say. Is it, I don't think that I don't think that it's just about taking the mushroom or the pill, depending on what type of psychedelic you're taking. I think it's also, so since we're kind of throwing around famous terms or cliched terms perhaps in psychedelics, the other one is set and setting, the importance of mindset, the intention, and the setting. So I like to think that set, and especially setting, can also have a large impact on the nature of the experience and what it does for people. But I don't have direct evidence. I mean, I don't have direct evidence that if you give a narcissist psychedelics in a very supportive setting, they're going to stop being narcissistic. I can only theorize about that. And then just to go back again to, you're asking about evidence. So there is this kind of indirect evidence from clinical research. But this is a question that certainly requires more study, more scientific study. And there's not much out there beyond anecdotes at this point.
Yeah, but so that's why probably you're also running or conducting your connected leadership study, where you probably also want to evaluate these relationships between psychedelic intake and a certain curriculum with respect to leadership traits or behaviors, right?
Yes, the way the research is set up, the participants, there is of course a psychedelic experience. There were two psilocybin sessions, several days apart. So there's a retreat it's a 6-day retreat, and the participants in the retreat, first of all, it's a very well supported retreat. So regardless of whether it's a leadership retreat or whatever the purpose of retreat is, as you obviously know, you want it to be well supported with well-trained facilitators who are capable of, just supporting people, as I said. In our particular programs, we have that. We also, the program also includes coaching with some really amazing executive coaches who out of Northern California. And the coaching is, again, without going into too much detail, the coaching is focused on kind of regenerative thinking, redesign in complex systems, things of this nature. So there is a regenerative container, if you will, in which the retreat takes place.
Chris, you want to ask a question or?
Yeah, maybe. I love the idea that now probably you haven't said it this way, but maybe it's kind of how you would say psychedelics are catalysts for attunement, so attunement catalysts. So you're testing then under which conditions can that actually happen? So people move from the mechanistic to a more synthetic, holistic kind of form of attunement. And before we spoke about like what are the risks that actually pathological behaviors or narcissistic behaviors or egomaniacal behaviors might be reinforced, because if we speak about leaders, sometimes those make it to the top that are most ruthless and maybe most antisocial. And then we have spoken about the risk of spiritual bypassing or messiah's complex or even and so on. And so it would be really interesting to see like what are the necessary interventions to mitigate that risk or help people really make new emotional and relational reference experiences that really change something deeply in the way they relate to the world, and help them on the integration path that actually this can be sustained, right? I think this is like the big question. What is kind of the way to do it? I don't like.
And again, I don't have like a perfect answer by any stretch. I guess the one thing I would note, going back to some of the points Dmitrij was making, and we do have these anecdotes of people who have taken psychedelics and seem to have stayed and continued to engage in sort of toxic behavior, like the QAnon shaman, it's kind of an archetypal example that people often use. But we've been discussing the importance of set and setting. The QAnon shaman might have taken lots of mushrooms, but I don't know what the set and setting was, but I'm guessing it wasn't doing that in the context of a container that was more focused on connection and regeneration. So
yeah, or development. I mean,
it's just personal development.
Yeah. I mean, you could. I mean, as you said, like there are different ways to look at the work. There is the whole sphere of psychedelic assisted therapy, really therapeutical clinical work, and then there is, let's say, maybe for functional people working then in organizations or in other contexts, like more focused on personal development and. Maybe the right framing and the right support, especially then in the integration phase, would really open new possibilities for people, and then the support, like of a community of like-minded people, and of course, like then coaches, or as you mentioned, might really make the difference here, and help catalyze like beneficial change towards this kind of the right way, the right form of attunement.
Sorry.
I was just gonna say, I mean, for all the examples I know of narcissists who have become more narcissistic and things of that nature, I also know plenty of examples in some of these, firsthand, of people who were previously would characterize themselves as having previously been in leadership positions where they were behaving in a very extractive way, and had profound shifts with the assistance of psychedelics, again, probably in a supportive setting, and are now working on projects that are focused on systems change and regeneration. So yeah, it's certainly possible.
I'm not sure actually my question what was a good one or not, but I wanted to play the devil's advocate and also ask to what extent is it ethical to prime people so much for about this whole regeneration topic, because of course, as you said, the setting makes the experience. So the assumption of you might need to change your mind, and we might need to kind of massage your brains a little bit so that you take on a new perspective on life. I mean, I totally agree with it, that we need a change towards a more holistic setting. Maybe some people would argue, well, isn't it actually kind of a brainwashing? And what would you answer to that?
Well, I mean, to be clear, so I've been using the word supportive, and we don't, participants in our study, they don't take a course on regenerative economics. We don't give them lectures on regenerative economics. As I said, they work with coaches prior to the retreat. But what the coaches do is they help the participants tap into their innate resourcefulness and creativity. I think that there is a sense in which I think that does pave the way for the types of shifts that we're talking about. But yeah, I mean, there are real questions around, you know, if you were to, you know, if you were to kind of brainwash someone, as you said, or, you know, subject them to all this regenerative economics and then give them psychedelics. Yeah, I don't know what the ethics of that would be. You know, I will say, one thing I'll add, the way the study is set up and the way that our research approval works, the participants that we're observing are attending psychedelic, the retreat part is a psychedelic retreat in the Netherlands. And they're paying to attend those retreats, and they choose to attend those retreats. I mean, we can't, you know, in science, like the perfect study is supposed to be like a randomized controlled trial where you go randomly assign some participants to the treatment and some to a placebo. You can't do that with it's hard to do it with psychedelics in general, because people often know if they've had the placebo. Not always, but often. But in this context, even putting that aside, we can't just go out and randomly choose corporate leaders and say, okay, you come here and we're going to give you some mushrooms. So these people, my point is the participants are self-selecting into the study. Now that does create a kind of bias, which I'll be totally, you know, candid about. And it also, I would say, maybe, you know, mitigates this issue to some extent, because they know what they're signing up for.
Mm.
Mhm.
No.
Yeah. So I love this idea, and of course, it's also how we think about it, that actually the change starts from within, right? And maybe that if we want to move from this paradigm of extraction and externalization to one of integration and internalization, then we don't have to look too much, or we shouldn't look first to the outside, to the systems and governance and so on, because many people have invested a lot of time and many resources into having the greatest plans and proposals and so on, but it's not changing, right? But that we should actually start from within and maybe help others go on this journey of development, and maybe create spaces for them where they can make those new reference experiences, be it with maybe psychedelics, where that's legal and in the right context, maybe with non-substance-based interventions and classical training, coaching, mindfulness, breathwork setups, or so on. And then still, we have like single leaders that have maybe made those new experiences and are transformed. And how does the system change now? So is it just like if you have a critical threshold reached of people that it will change?
Yeah.
Like, and where would that be? Would it be 10% or 20?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And even before you got to the end of it, I was thinking about an answer that I think speaks directly to this. So if you look at models from social network theory, these are models that are looking at the rate and the mechanisms by which an idea or a belief spreads throughout a population. It's daunting to think, oh, we have to get 100% of the people to change, right? Because that's a lot of people. But if you get to a certain point, you reach a tipping point. So once a certain percentage of the population holds a new idea or a belief, that idea or belief then takes off and spreads very rapidly to the rest of the population because of these social network dynamics. So there's no hard and fast number. I would say sort of an average for where the tipping point is from stuff that I've seen is 25%. If you talk to indigenous wisdom leaders in the global south, I've heard numbers. They don't talk about it in terms of social network dynamics, but I think they're getting at the same idea that they say 15%. Now, of course, that's assuming a kind of random sample from the population. If you're talking about people who already have outsized economic, social, and cultural influence, in other words, leaders, then the number would probably be more in the toward the lower end of that range. So that's one of the reasons that leaders, existing organizational leaders, are such an interesting population to work with. But whichever number you choose, I think it's much less daunting, and it's hopeful to recognize that we need to reach maybe 50 to 25% of the population for things to begin changing. And yeah, that's just, it seems a lot more attainable than 100% off the bat, you know.
And yeah, I mean, that kind of strikes the question of, well, does change come top down or bottom up? And while it might at first seem a bit paradoxical that leaders, again, are supposed to bring the change, which they haven't over the course of the last centuries, why now? But of course, you could say, well, because the concept of leadership itself changes and it stops being the hierarchical, pyramidal, top-down flow of information and power, but rather it's a renewed sense of
it's showing a new way of being rather than reinforcing the existing pattern. So this kind of hierarchical, patriarchal leadership is one of the intrinsic characteristics of the extractive pattern. So yeah, so it's thinking about it's as much how leaders behave and how they are and what they demonstrate as it is what they tell people to do. In fact, it's probably more their way of being than you know, the specific content of any directives they might give.
But so would that also be your answer if people ask, well, imagine somebody from a large corporation, he's a team leader, maybe higher, maybe he leads a department, undergoes an experience that for that person individually might be life-changing and give her or him new insights. And then he returns back to his or her organization. And the organization is still in the old paradigm, right? It's still maybe in this rationalistic, functionalistic mindset, whereas maybe the person has progressed or sees that we need to change. So how to deal with that chasm in mindsets?
Well, again, I'm not sure there is one answer for that either, but I do think that for people who have undergone these experiences and kind of are living differently, I think maybe the way the way the question is being framed, kind of underestimating the ability of people to influence their peers through the way they behave. And I think maybe many people have had this kind of experience when they meet somebody or they know someone who's undergone some sort of who's had some kind of transformative experience, and it seems, I mean, I actually just had this experience recently. I ran into somebody I hadn't seen in a long time that I used to know quite well, who really seemed like enlightened, and they told me about why they thought that was. They'd had this major shift. And so my reaction to that was, wow, I want some of that. What can I do to kind of walk that path? And so I think there's a natural element of curiosity. A lot of people, so we hear these statistics, again, in the US, we have what's being termed a mental health crisis, which I actually don't don't like that framing so much, because it implies that, maybe it implies that the problem is with you, it's with your brain. Maybe, it seems unrealistic to me that all of a sudden, over the course of a couple of decades, everybody's serotonin levels change. The reasons I think so many people are suffering from mental distress at the same time is that it's a systemic crisis. It's a spiritual crisis, or a cultural crisis, a crisis of meaning. And so the reason I bring this up is I think so many people feel mental distress. We have kind of epidemic rates of anxiety, of depression, of suicide, and they may not totally understand why that is. I mean, maybe there's a sense that it's somehow related to disconnection and kind of the alienating influence of our environment, but that's not something that that's not something that's talked about in therapy that much, as far as I know. And therapy itself, for many folks, is again embodies the same kind of it reflects the same kind of individualistic orientation. So anyway, so I'm being long-winded. My point is this: if people are already feeling this distress, then I think that actually predisposes them to be open to alternative ways of being. They just need to see what the alternative is. And most people can't even think to imagine a different reality. So may I say one more thing here? I feel like I'm getting a long answer, but there's this famous concept. This is called the social construction of reality. And what the social construction reality refers to is that we engage in these habituated behaviors that we have learned to engage in from the time we were born as a result of all the institutions and influences that surround us. We engage in these habituated behaviors. Taken together, these habituated behaviors at the individual level, collectively, they create a pattern of society. And we then accept that pattern as an external and immutable fact. So for an example, and to kind of relate this to economics, if we're all taught from the time we're born that we live in a world in which we have to take the biggest piece of pie to survive, then we will actually create a pattern in which taking a big piece of pie, or the biggest piece of pie, becomes necessary or helpful for survival. So kind of breaking that self-reinforcing habit loop, I think is part of what psychedelics can help to do. And there's research showing that, and people who have taken psychedelics, I don't think would have a lot of trouble believing this either, that psychedelics can help to shift metaphysical beliefs about the fundamental nature of being. So again, so the reason I bring this up here is if people are feeling distressed and anxious, and that is at some level, whether they're conscious of it or not, if that's at some level a reaction to the extractive pattern of our economic system and the other humanly devised systems that we have, then being able to pull yourself out of that and recognize that is something that's constructed and is not, in fact, an inherent and immutable reality, I think can help take people a big piece of the way toward moving in this direction. I hope that was an answer to your question. I kind of you catalyze a number of thoughts. So.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question, because you come from originally studying those institutional dynamics as well, right? And stakeholder analysis and economic analysis and so on. And so what about the macro structures that we have created? That's kind of ossified, right? How international relations are structured. Game theory. Daniel Schmachtenberger, he talks about the multipolar trap. So the arms race in terms of not just military, but technology. Who wins the AI race? Is it China or is it the US, and so on? So those are very powerful, let's say, external forces that are a reality, right? So even if in the US or in Germany, we have then 15 or 20% of people have shifted, and the whole cultural discourse shifts and the way people are with each other. Is there anything that is on your mind, how we can address those big systems dynamic that are of course they're man-made, we have created them but the we doesn't exist, because we have different nation states, for example, in this struggle for domination and power. So can you give us hope, Bennett?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess there are two things I would say. So the first is that our current system is already degenerating. We are at the end of an evolutionary epoch. So a new pattern is going to emerge one way or another. The old pattern is collapsing. So part of the question is, can we steer that pattern? But in terms of the silver lining, these institutions, they seem extremely powerful, but I don't think that they actually have the ability to survive for that much longer, because the conditions to which they're contributing are not consistent with life. So whether you find that hopeful or frightening, it's a little bit of both, right? Because there's no guarantee that what emerges is going to be better, and there's also no guarantee that we can steer towards something better. So that's the first, maybe little bit of hope, mildly hopeful response. The other is that it's true that these institutions seem remarkably powerful, but you could think back on historical examples. For example, the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union seemed extremely powerful. It was extremely powerful, and this is really kind of this is reducing the story of what happened to a lot. But you had these uprisings that started with a relatively small percent of the population in these republics that didn't even have a lot of communication. These individual republics within the Soviet Union that didn't even have a lot of communication amongst them, and once that reached a certain portion of the population, that entire system collapsed. And when it collapsed to the outside, I mean, maybe there were Soviet specialists or analysts who saw it coming sooner. I think to a lot of people, it appeared as if it happened very rapidly. So the kind of collapse of the institutions, once it happened, appeared rapid. But I think that the forces that led to that collapse, there was already a process of systems change going on. So again, going back to what I was saying a minute ago, we are in a process of systems change. And I guess one other thing I'll add, so we're already in this process. The nature of system change is such that you don't necessarily see what appears to be the big event until it's already underway. And the third thing I'll add is there are signs of things being done differently. For example, I was recently listening to a podcast with a guy named Donnie McClurkin, who founded and leads the Institute for the Postgrad Institute, or the Institute for Postgrad Economics. I can't remember the exact name. Anyway, he said in his research, he found that roughly 20% of global GDP is currently produced by not-for-profit organizations. And that doesn't necessarily mean philanthropically funded nonprofits, although it includes them. But a lot of those are for-profit organizations that are owned by foundations that have some sort of broader social mission. So these are organizations that produce profits, but the profits aren't extracted by shareholders. The profits are reinvested into the mission of the business. So the reason I bring this up is this is kind of this change happening from the bottom. Or in the US, something like 120 million people, he points out, are members of credit unions, which are banking institutions that are community-based and aren't owned by external shareholders. So the point is, we have these elements of systems change occurring, and we may be less aware of the extent to which things are the extent to which the change process is, in action than we think.
Yeah. So the change will happen, and I think we all need to strive towards creating a transition that in the end will be in support of life, and not against life. And so, yeah, Bennett, I think we're slowly also coming to an end, given the time. Let me just summarize that or point out how important the work you're doing is. And I think we need a lot more people in academia like you who dare also to go a little bit against the orthodoxy of economics and really question the status quo and look for viable alternatives, because clearly ignoring the problems and capitalizing and kind of trying to get as much of the pie that is still available is not going to bring us anywhere. So just a few words of
Thank you.
appreciation for your super
Thanks.
important work. And of course, for us, for the Evolute Institute, the intersection of psychedelics and leadership is where we are working on as well. So that's highly relevant also to our work. Thanks a lot, really, for bringing this into the world, and especially for taking the time to be here with Christopher and me on this little podcast.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me, and yeah, and thank you for your work too. This is definitely a collaborative effort, and yeah, I'm very appreciative of the contribution that you're making to it as well.